What?
Well, Ubisoft have finally gone and done it. They've made the game they should have made 15 years ago. And no, I'm not talking about Far Cry Blood Dragon 2. I'm talking about an Assassin's Creed game set in Japan.
What took you so long?
One that's also got a common dilemma in that it's one of those things where people have pretty much already made their mind up on it before having even played it. Much in the same way that most people have already made their mind up on what they think of this video before they've even heard me say my piece.
Hey, what's going on? War! We're going to war!
Either way, despite being plagued by delays and drama on Twitter, Ubisoft Quebec's latest entry in this long-running franchise is finally here. And after having spent over 30 hours with this thing, I can confidently say that it is an Assassin's Creed game. Before I start though, let's address the elephant in the room by saying that this is not a sponsored video. I wasn't paid by Ubisoft to cover this, nor was I flown to Disneyland or taken whale watching. I got the same review code in the same email that all the other content creators and media folks did as well. And if you're one of those people who already doesn't like this game without even having played it, which is fine by the way, well, then you're better off just not watching this video because I doubt I'm going to be able to change your mind. What I'm mostly going to be talking about is just the way the game looks, plays, and feels. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, well then yeah, stick around.
Yeah. Stick around.
Right, so much like a lot of the other Assassin's Creed games, the whole experience is the player seeing all of these past events played out in real time through the Animus. The Animus being this made-up virtual reality machine that can read someone's DNA and is then able to project out all these memories. This time the whole thing takes place in feudal Japan, the best kind of Japan, specifically in 1579, during the reign of Oda Nobunaga.
Go. Find Momochi Sandayu. His death will sever the sword from the hand of Iga.
Japan is at the height of this brutal civil war, along with it also being around the same time that firearms were introduced into warfare, which means you got people running around with more rifles, katanas and smoke bombs than in a Fortnite match. And for the first time in the series, I think since Assassin's Creed Syndicate, you're able to play as two characters. Both a shinobi girl named Naoe, and then this big bad samurai named Yasuke, who's responsible for most of the game's outrage culture.
My name is Yasuke.
Though I think we should be more outraged that Naoe is more or less just a reskinned Habana from Rainbow Six Siege. Anyway, right off the bat, it is worth mentioning that the opening of the game does have some really weird pacing. I mean, the whole thing starts off with this prologue sequence involving Yasuke, who was picked up adrift in the ocean by Portuguese Jesuits, to then be brought to Japan as a slave, which is where he meets Oda Nobunaga.
But your servant, Diogo, stays.
Only for it to then time jump into the future at a point when Oda and his forces are now attacking the Iga province, which is where Naoe and her family reside. By this point, he's now a fully fledged samurai as well, and also shown to be incredibly adept, with the player in control of him during this short prologue where you just steamroll through pretty much everything. It's kind of like the opening scene of The Force Unleashed, where Vader just goes around decimating Wookiees. Then after that, it cuts to Naoe's perspective during this same attack, as she's tasked with getting back a box that's been stolen.
You said you wanted help. Now's the time.
Needless to say, she fails, and the box is then stolen by this mysterious group of 12 figures, calling themselves the Shin Bakufu, who are kind of similar to the Cult of Cosmos in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or the Wardens of War in Valhalla. From that point on, there's a very lengthy series of cinematics and cutscenes showing Naoe being nursed back to health, before she then sets off to investigate this group one by one and get vengeance for the attack. And yeah, like, you gotta admit, it is a pretty cool premise, playing as this badass super pissed off shinobi babe whose new purpose in life is just to go around and murder everyone who did it wrong. It's kind of hard to not be reminded of the bride in Kill Bill, and in fact some of the music during these early action scenes really sounds like something that Tarantino would have used. I will say too that there's some surprisingly likable side characters here as well, with the real standouts being this kid named Jinjiro who lost his dad in the war and now clings to Naoe like she's the big sister he never had.
I've come to stay with you!
What?
What?
Along with a smart-ass thief named Ganojo who kinda looks like he should be out of an Onimusha game. Now he's the typical thief with a heart of gold, just trying to be like a Japanese Robin Hood, and he's also one of the potential romance options for Naoe.
A charming offer, thief. I'll think about it once you've sobered up. And bathed.
Oh yeah, before you ask, there's no romance here between Naoe and Yasuke.
Yes.
And a few of these side characters can even be called in to help out during gameplay, giving them even more of a purpose.
This was a worthy battle.
You got this whole side mechanic of being able to build up your hideout too and customize it however you want. Having to smuggle back supplies from enemy camps like it's MGS5. And every time you go back there, you can see all these characters walking around and keeping themselves busy. And it just goes a long way in making the world feel more lived in and populated. It also does feel like they've done their best here to try to facilitate every kind of player. I mean, for instance, you've got the option to play the story in the so-called canon mode, which automatically chooses dialogue responses for the player. Or you can instead choose your own if you want to see where things lead.
I will not hesitate.
We've got different settings for navigation with optional features like a waypoint guide to help you find where you need to go. As well as the option for this so-called immersive mode where everyone speaks Japanese and not English. Although much like Ghost of Tsushima, this doesn't seem to be the intended choice, as the lip syncing just doesn't match up at all.
But this is not about any one of us.
What also kind of surprised me is that it's not always just about hunting down and killing every one of these characters you come across, with there even being a few instances where you can spare them once new information comes to light.
My brother Golo is not like them either. I beg your mercy for his sake.
Visually too, the whole thing is pretty damn stunning. And I don't know what the going rate these days is for environmental artists, but I gotta say that these guys deserve a raise. The amount of detail in the world in these games has always been pretty top-notch stuff, and again, you could easily just spend hours walking around and checking out what all the NPCs are up to, with there always being something going on here. There's great lighting and weather effects, with the wind and the rain looking particularly awesome. And I don't know what it is about raining in video games, but I'm really just a sucker for that kind of thing. And when it's also in the same game where I'm running along rooftops and cutting people down with a Tanto, well then even better. Even just the shifting between seasons can really dynamically alter the way the world looks, with NPCs dressing accordingly depending on what period it's in. And when you're out in those more rural areas, it's common to see deer, monkeys, and other animals running around too. In fact, there's so much wildlife running around at times that it almost becomes comedic, because it seems every few feet there's some kind of critter running past your eye line. Oh yeah, and I really like it too how when you summon your mount, most of the time your character's going to automatically jump onto it.
That's a good idea.
Early on in the story, Naoe gets injured and has a scar across her face, and throughout the rest of the campaign, you can even see this thing slowly healing up the more time passes. So outside of a few moments where I had a choppy frame rate, it all seemed to run and look pretty damn good, with not a single crash to the desktop in the 30 odd hours I spent with it. What I do think is a bit weird though is the inconsistency with the water effects, where sometimes you'll swim through a body of water and the whole thing displaces and moves around realistically. But then other times it's like the water is just a flat, transparent surface that you're clipping through with it not even moving about at all. You've also got all that other immersion breaking stuff like seeing objects or characters clip through their clothing and outfits, which in its defense is probably to be expected considering there's like 50 of these. But still, like to see a kunai clip through someone's clothing during an emotional scene, like, yeah, it's a bit of a buzzkill. And while the voice acting is generally pretty good across the board along with the facial animations, there's definitely like interactions here where the whole thing just looks and sounds so wooden.
Forgive me.
We did 20 takes, and that was the best one.
It's also got a whole lot of those Ubisoft-isms, do you know what I mean? The kind of weird and wacky things that you really only see in an Ubisoft game.
I have to get involved if you're extorting the people of this town.
Extortion? I will show you extortion!
Well, we're waiting.
From that point on as well, when you're playing as Naoe, is where the whole thing really kicks off. And she's also who you're going to be playing as for the next 10 or so hours at least. Because it's not until you're a fair ways in where, for story-related reasons, Naoe finally meets up with Yasuke. And then the two realize that they're actually far more aligned than they thought.
You really think you stand a chance?
Another step, and we will both find out.
And once this guy joins up with her, you can swap between them at any time. Certain missions might force you into one or the other, but for most of the main story stuff, you're given the option to choose, with it then vastly affecting how things play out. Literally. I mean, if you realize you got to sneak into an enemy castle to get some information, well, then maybe swap over to Naoe and you're good to go. But if it looks like subtlety ain't on the main agenda, then using Yasuke might be the better choice. Considering that Naoe, for instance, is your typical shinobi slash ninja type of character, using a grappling hook to pull herself up the side of buildings, along with skulking around in the bushes and the shadows, as well as having a few ninja gadgets to use to her advantage. With the kunai, the smoke bomb, the distraction bell, and the shuriken. Yeah, I love the shuriken. All of this stuff plays out more or less the same as every other Assassin's Creed game ever made, and is really where the main movement and parkour stuff takes place, with Naoe's tiny frame being perfect for the kind of stealth immobility that she needs. What's crazy too is that they actually have a somewhat developed stealth system this time, instead of it just being all based around line of sight. And for the first time in the series, light actually plays a part in how visible you are, with sticking to the shadows keeping you fully hidden, and there even being light sources you can extinguish to maintain your cover. So yeah, like it only took Ubisoft almost 25 years to achieve what their own game, Splinter Cell, was doing back in the early 2000s. Along with also being able to go fully prone and crawl around, which is something that Metal Gear Solid's been doing for almost 30. It also seems that the seasons affect things as well, because in quite a neat touch, Shadows has not only a night and day cycle, but also a yearly one too. With there being less enemies outside during winter, for instance, probably to stay out of the cold, along with the benefit of the snow muffling your footsteps. Whereas on the flip side, during summer and spring, you're going to be more audible, but there's more bushes and grass to hide in.
Cool. Yeah, it is cool.
Apart from that stuff though, which really doesn't affect things too much, this is more or less the same stealth system we've seen a dozen times before, where you just try to stick to the high ground and assassinate people before they've even seen you. You can still whistle from a hiding spot to draw someone to your position, and it's still laughably easy here to just smoke bomb a group of enemies and then use the hidden blade on them before they've even recovered. You got the old classic double assassination, killing two enemies at once, and also that old chestnut where you take someone out and then kill someone nearby with a throwable item. A takedown move that I think's been in every Ubisoft game since Far Cry 3. What I do find disappointing though is how there's no way to control the time of the day, or at least as far as I could find. I mean, the stealth is objectively easier at nighttime, right? In the sense that most of the guards are going to be asleep and there's less of them patrolling. But then also because that cover of darkness gives you far more options to avoid being seen. So as a result, you're always going to want to be doing all the stealth stuff at night, but the problem is that you're at the mercy of what time of day it actually is, considering you've got no control over it. You know, unless of course you want to stand around for 15 minutes waiting for it to change. And I just don't see why they couldn't incorporate some kind of time passing mechanic here, where Naoe could meditate or something to progress the hours. I mean, you can choose to change the season, but not the time of day. Yeah, that makes sense. It'd be like how in MGS5 where you could just sit there smoking a cigar to pass the time. I mean, even the old Elder Scrolls games let you stand around and wait out the clock if you wanted to. And it's just the small things like this, the little side inclusions, that would have really made a good stealth system genuinely great. I do reckon as well that the assassination animations can still look really janky at times, especially those ones you do from cover, where you can see the NPC pretty much stop in place while they just wait to die. It's just this very noticeable halt in their animation where you can literally see them just stop dead in their tracks. There's a really cool idea here where when you're playing as Naoe, you can't assassinate the larger enemies at first, simply because the premise of a 5-foot tall girl being able to overpower someone 3 times her size is, physically impossible. Even though, of course, later in the game you unlock an ability that just lets you do it anyway.
Of course.
Anyway, my point is that even with this, there's some weird animations as well. Like when sometimes you try to do it, she's just going to instantly go into this cowering position on the floor.
What an asshole.
I also still find the parkour system to be a bit janky, and the movement still feels really inorganic. It's just kind of like you don't really feel like you're moving seamlessly from area to area. You just feel like you're going from that one preset movement position to the next, like you're a puzzle piece clicking into all of these slots. It really is like they just kind of maxed out the parkour controls in those earlier games and never really advanced it from that point on. As a point of comparison, like go and play something like Mirror's Edge, for instance, and compare how the free running feels in that game to how it feels in Assassin's Creed.
That's good stuff.
Also, what are we, like 15 games deep at this point, and yet it is still so hard at times to simply just drop off a fucking ledge. Like seriously man, why is it so hard to drop off something? I mean, you can hold down the B button to constantly lower yourself down, but even then, like that still takes way too long. And what a perfect summarization of platforming controls in modern gaming too, right? Like remember in the olden days how you used to try your hardest to not fall off ledges? But then in a modern game, I'm trying my hardest to do the opposite. Still though, playing as Naoe is the Assassin's Creed element to the game. And like most of these other entries, I always find the most fun to be had when you're just going around assassinating people or exploring all the various enemy camps. You got all the various castles around the map, and to clear these out, you need to kill a bunch of nearby samurai, to then unlock a chest containing legendary gear. And I spent a fair chunk of my time just going around and clearing these out alone, trying to find new and creative ways to take out these samurai without getting spotted. If you set off an alarm during any of this stuff, you also get a wanted level in that region. And then the game sends out these unique NPCs to hunt you down, which is pretty cool. Oh yeah, and because there's so many unique targets to find and assassinate, there was at least like half a dozen instances when I came across a random one of these completely by chance. Regardless of who you're playing as though, at some point you're gonna get into combat, which really is the least evolved aspect. And if you played any of these games in the recent years, well, then this is all gonna seem very familiar. So you got both a light and a heavy attack along with a posture attack, which is simply holding down either button to charge it up for a bit more damage or to break someone's block. Blue attacks from enemies can be parried, but red attacks have to be dodged, with both of them throwing an enemy off balance and leaving them vulnerable if you wait until the last possible moment, with vulnerable enemies then taking more damage. Some of the enemies are wearing armor, so you first need to whack that stuff off before you can even damage their health. And there is a pretty cool ASMR element to this stuff as well, with the armor making this satisfying crack when it finally breaks. With the first main difference between the two characters during all of this being the weapons they use and then their combat abilities. Naoe, for instance, gets the katana, the tanto, and the kusarigama, whereas Yasuke gets the long katana, the naginata, and the kanabo. And it really is a whole David and Goliath situation here, with Naoe's attacks looking very glancing, whereas Yasuke just unleashes these wild, decimating blows, where it really looks like he's putting his entire weight into it. especially when you're carrying around the bigger weapons like the Kanabo, where he swings that thing around like it's a giant slab of concrete and smashes someone's head clean off like he's hitting a home run. Oh yeah, and if you're not using one of these things as soon as possible, well, then you're playing the game wrong. The Naginata takedown is even more brutal, right? With him chopping off someone's arms, then finally lopping off their head. Which for a game that constantly goes on about honor and all that kind of stuff, seems like a pretty damn dishonorable way to kill someone. Now when you're playing as Naoe, combat can be super spongy, but I do kind of suspect that they've done this on purpose, considering she's not really supposed to be any kind of super samurai. I mean, she can hold off a couple of enemies pretty easily, but if it gets to be more than that, then you're probably just going to want to haul ass and try to lose the heat. It also feels like the only way they knew how to make the combat challenging here is to have it so she takes insane damages from hits, often losing like an entire health bar from a single blow against an enemy that's on her level. And I'm really not a fan of how Shadows has brought back all this level-dependent gear. Dozens, if not hundreds, of different pieces of armor and weapons, which all have arbitrary numbers and stats. Which makes it feel like it's less about your actual skill during combat and more just whether or not your katana or your naginata is high enough level to effectively damage someone. Now you can upgrade these items to your current level at any time at the forge back at your hideout, but the higher the item level gets, obviously the more expensive the resources are going to be, to the point that it's not economically viable to upgrade every piece. Which means that most likely you'll be swapping back and forth with this stuff constantly to just max out your health and your damage output. But even then, like, it doesn't really fix this underlying issue of it feeling like the enemies are just soaking up all your attacks and abilities. It just feels like they're trying to encourage the player to use Yasuke for all of this stuff, and yeah, I mean, why not? I mean, the dude just fucking annihilates everything that gets in his way. Pretty damn violently too, man, like cutting people's heads off like they're Frankfurt sausages or hoisting them up in the air like the goddamn Kurgan or something. One of the main finishes for the Kanabo has him just towering over someone and then smashing their skull in, like, yikes.
You got knocked the fuck out!
Very early on as well, I found a piece of armor that had a stat on it which let me block and parry the red attacks, the ones which I'd normally have to avoid. And then from that point on, it just made the combat sequences laughable. Laughable. It's like that bit in Final Fantasy VII where you get to play alongside Sephiroth, and he just goes around one-shotting all the enemies that have kicked your ass for the past 10 hours. The problem is when playing as Yasuke, it just doesn't feel like an Assassin's Creed game. Because two of the main components which make up the vast majority of the series, that being the stealth and the parkour, are more or less just completely gone. Replaced with this dude who's just built like a linebacker and about as inconspicuous as a pea stain on a suede couch. I mean, he does get the bow as a ranged weapon, which can be used to an extent to remain stealthy, but your max arrow count for the bow is pretty low. Not to mention, his other ranged weapon, the Teppo, is about as unstealthy as it possibly gets. So they're definitely trying to force you into the more direct approach. His version of Naoe's assassination, for instance, is a brutal assassination, where he first gets someone's attention by shouting at them, before then just turning them into a human piñata.
Face me!
Damn.
And let's not also forget that he's built like a goddamn brick shithouse, which means that definitely climbing up the side of buildings, grappling up pagodas, or leaping gracefully from rooftop to rooftop is just out of the question. He can literally just run right through certain walls as well, like he's the Kool-Aid man, and running into enemies is going to knock them on their ass. And if you do a leap of faith from any of the viewpoints, he'll just fall to the ground like a total klutz, and then make some kind of remark about how dumb he looked.
Any landing you can walk away from is good enough.
In the game's defense though, this does all make sense, do you know what I mean? Given the dude is decked out in full samurai body armor, is well over 6 foot tall and probably weighs well over 200 pounds. But that doesn't change the fact that when you're playing as him, it just feels like an entirely different game. Not to mention, like, I'm starting to wonder if it even makes sense how we're seeing out Yasuke's experiences at all. I mean, I thought this whole thing was taking place inside the Animus, right? Which means I'm accessing my ancestors' memories and witnessing their life events through my own eyes. But then, how am I able to see both Yasuke and Naoe's experiences if this is the same one strand? I mean, if that's the case, then these two must somehow be related, right? With Assassin's Creed Syndicate as an example, this made perfect sense because both the lead characters were twins. Some of Yasuke's unique missions, for instance, are these ones that go into vivid detail on how he trained to become a samurai, and then everything that happened to him while he served with Nobunaga. But then it's also able to show me all the stuff that Naoe did as well. Like, it doesn't make any sense, does it?
Trust me. Follow my instruction.
Or maybe it does make sense, considering the whole Animus subplot has been a bit of an afterthought for almost a decade now. And I think what it really just boils down to is that they're just trying to offer up two different playstyles. Letting the player choose if they want to go in as Yasuke and just cut everyone's head off, or be a bit more subtle as Naoe and take the less direct approach. The only thing is that this is Assassin's Creed, and the whole series is supposed to be about the less direct approach. Do you know what I mean? The approach where you stab someone through a rice paper wall before they even know what hit them. And yeah, like, I know this is also the same series where you engaged in all-out naval combat in the Caribbean Ocean, but at the end of all of that, like, Edward Kenway was still getting up there close and personal with that hidden blade. You feel me?
Got the gist.
For most of the main story missions here, you can choose who you want to play as, but for quite a few of them, you've got no choice, and have to experience things as Yasuke. So yeah, like, I get why this might piss certain people off. The good news, at least, is that the XP you earn for one character does carry over to the other, and there's gear that is unique to both of them. So you don't ever feel like you're wasting your time, and you're not going to be under-leveled if you spend a few hours as Naoe or vice versa. What is weird though, is that at certain points you can choose between them for a boss fight, and then in what's an absolute wasted opportunity, during these fights, the other character is just absent the entire time. I don't know, like they've gone off to take a shit or something. And I was really hoping for some kind of assistance or tag team moment during these instances. You know, kind of like the stuff they did in Arkham Knight. Either way though, I definitely enjoyed playing as Naoe the most here. Simply because that's when it felt the most like Assassin's Creed. You know, the name of the game itself. One of the first ninja games I first ever really played was the original Tenchu on the PlayStation, and in some ways, almost 30 years later, kind of feels like I'm right back there again. Sneaking across rooftops at nighttime and slitting the throats of samurai while they've got their backs turned. Versus playing as Yasuke, where I run around and cave someone's torso in with a giant club. I also do want to briefly touch on the criticism over the historical accuracy and the so-called lack of respect towards Japanese culture, which is a weird statement, you know what I mean, given every single other game in the franchise.
Yes.
And what I've always thought is cool about this series is the way they combine the factual with the fantasy, letting you explore this slice of time long since past, but also adding in enough of the weird fictional made-up stuff to keep the whole thing interesting and unique. And off the back of that, it is kind of odd to see people bring this stuff up in regards to Yasuke, and how it's not portraying his character 100% true to life, considering this is the same series where you've got Leonardo da Vinci making guns and poisoned darts, or the same series where you fight creatures from Greek and Irish mythology. It's like watching that episode of Doctor Who and complaining about how historically inaccurate it is that Vincent van Gogh hopped into the TARDIS. Wait, is it Van Gogh or Van Gogh? Or that Genghis Khan learned how to skateboard in Bill and Ted. And in fact, I think if anything, Shadows is more historically accurate, considering it doesn't have any of the supernatural or mythological elements, at least not in the base game. Just fighting the same regular humans, either samurai, ronin, or shinobi. As for it being disrespectful, well, that's kind of laughable as well. I mean, as an example, one of the main side tasks is going around to the dozens of different religious shrines and praying, either as Naoe or Yasuke. There's another side task where you paint the local wildlife by sneaking up on them quietly so they're not disturbed. During the cinematics, characters all adhere to the basic social protocols, almost to a boring degree. And there's even one whole mission chain where you need to be taught the proper etiquette for a traditional tea ceremony.
We drink from a common bowl. Each turns it slightly to the right. In this way, the front, the most beautiful part of the bowl, faces the host and other guests as a sign of humility.
Is there anything else I should know?
Then having to remember what you've learned shortly after that during the real thing so you don't blow your cover. Or I don't know, how about the fact that there's an entire fucking codex in here with pages and pages of historical details on all factors of Japanese life at the time. From all the different cities and settlements through to pages on religious aspects like the Torii gates. I guess my point is that if you're going to have that kind of discussion and bring up that criticism in regards to shadows, well, then you also need to start looking 20-something years back when we were getting into fist fights with the Pope.
Let's say I was to believe you.
Overall, there's just so much stuff here to get distracted by, and even at the 30 or so hour mark, I'd barely scratched the surface of what was on offer. And while that is a good thing, kind of, it's also definitely hard to not be fatigued by all the repetition, considering when you break the whole thing down, you're really just doing the same few activities over and over. Like picking up all those resources to improve your hideout, for instance, or upgrade your weapons, all of which is done through the same few missions handed out at all the various scout locations on the map. And every single one of these is just infiltrating the same looking enemy camp, and then either stealing the resources, assassinating a key figure, or killing everyone in the area. There might be like a bit of variation to the layouts of the enemies and the items, but this is the exact same mechanic every single time. Like I mentioned earlier as well, instead of outposts to capture, Shadows has castles, which are these enemy encampments where you need to find and kill those samurai in the area, before then unlocking a chest within the castle to get that legendary gear. And again, it is the exact same process every time I'm picking these guys off one by one, then just climbing up to that tower to open the chest. I also found the vendor UI in this thing to be incredibly tedious, especially when dismantling items or trying to sell my stuff off. Because you can only do this for one item at a time, which means having to sit there waiting 2 to 3 seconds for it to process, whilst you clear out your inventory bit by bit. And why they didn't just include some kind of bulk sell or bulk dismantle option is beyond me. It's also kind of hard to not feel like the story's dragging its heels a bit, and even by the 30-hour mark when I'd finally dealt with all those 12 members, the story was still going. Now with this whole epilogue sequence where it essentially splits into 2 directions, with both characters still having like a half a dozen or so different missions to get completed before you finally hit those end credits. And it's like, there is such a thing as too much stuff going on. If you've got a dozen different plot lines and missions going at once, well, then you start to forget where your actual goals are, and it just makes the whole thing feel directionless.
Is there anything else I should know?
And it's kind of hard not to feel like none of it really matters, because it's just another thing you're trying to get through for the sake of finishing it. I don't know, it's too much. It's too much.
It's too much! It's too much!
At the end of the day, like, I'm not going to sit here and recommend or not recommend this thing to anyone because, like I said before, this is the kind of game series where people have already made their minds up. Did I enjoy the whole thing, though? Well, yeah, I did.
I can't deny a certain something.
And I'm sure there's going to be a whole bunch of people out there who will pick up on stuff and complain about it, but the fact of the matter is that despite all the delays and the drama, Ubisoft have still managed to deliver another solid entry into a series which really has become the video game equivalent of fast food. Are we going to be talking about this one for the decades to come? Well, probably not. But if you're looking for something to sink a couple of weeks into while you wait for Doom the Dark Ages or the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake, well, then damn dog, you could do a hell of a lot worse.
Scatter your hate into the wind.